The stadium was still electric with energy. Fans roared, celebrating another dominant performance from Aaron Donald. He had just finished one of the best games of his career, his presence on the field undeniable. As he made his way toward the tunnel, surrounded by teammates and security, a voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Aaron Donald." Donald slowed. The tone was different, not just excitement, but something deeper. A U.S. Army sergeant stood at the front of the crowd, his uniform crisp, his eyes locked on Donald. Security hesitated, ready to intervene, but Donald lifted a hand, stopping them. No one knew what was about to happen. Aaron Donald had just dominated the field for 4 straight quarters. His jersey was drenched in sweat, his body aching from the relentless battle in the trenches. But none of that mattered now. The game was over. His job was done. As he walked toward the tunnel, the adrenaline still pulsing through his veins, he heard it, a sharp, commanding voice. "Aaron Donald!" It was not the usual shout of a fan looking for an autograph. This was different. There was power behind it, a weight that made Donald pause. He turned his head, scanning the crowd, and then he saw him. A U.S. Army sergeant stood at the front of the barrier, his uniform pressed, his boots planted firmly on the concrete. His posture was rigid, his expression unreadable. Something about the way the sergeant stood made Donald take notice. This was not just some casual fan moment. This was something deeper. Security immediately took a step forward, sensing the intensity of the moment. They were trained to act fast when fans got too close. But before they could intervene, Donald raised his hand, stopping them. "I got this," he said, his voice calm but firm. The sergeant took a step closer to the railing, his fists clenched at his sides. His breathing was measured, but there was something in his eyes, something heavy. Donald took a few steps forward, closing the distance between them. "All right," Donald said, his voice steady. "What is on your mind?" The crowd around them grew silent. People who had been laughing and celebrating just moments ago were now frozen, waiting. The sergeant swallowed hard, his chest rising and falling, as if he were trying to steady himself for what he was about to say. "You do not remember me," the sergeant said, his voice thick with emotion. Donald narrowed his eyes. He had met thousands of people throughout his career, but something told him this was not just any fan. The sergeant exhaled, his hands shaking slightly as he continued. "But I remember you." And with that, the stadium, once deafening, fell completely silent. Aaron Donald held his ground, his eyes locked on the sergeant. The energy around them had shifted. This was no longer just a simple post-game interaction. The crowd sensed it. The security team hesitated, unsure if they should step in or let the moment play out. The sergeant stood firm, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His breathing was controlled, but his chest rose and fell like someone trying to contain a flood of emotions. Donald took a slow step closer. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "What is on your mind?" The sergeant swallowed hard, his throat visibly tightening. He took a sharp breath, his jaw flexing as he prepared to speak. "You do not remember me," the sergeant said, his voice laced with something deep, something more than admiration, more than respect. Donald's brows knitted together. He had met countless people throughout his career, shaken thousands of hands, signed jerseys for fans all over the world, but something about this moment felt different. The sergeant let out a shaky breath. "But I remember you," he said, his voice quieter this time. A few fans nearby exchanged confused glances. The tension in the air was thick. The stadium, once filled with deafening cheers, now felt like it was holding its breath. Donald took another step forward, his eyes narrowing. "Where did we meet?" The sergeant's lips pressed into a thin line. For a long moment, he did not answer. Instead, his eyes glistened. Finally, he spoke. "Years ago," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I was stationed overseas, in a place where every day felt like it could be my last. Donald's expression shifted. He could feel the weight in the sergeant's voice, the gravity of what he was about to say. The sergeant clenched his fists tighter, his knuckles turning white. I was struggling. I lost friends. I lost parts of myself. He exhaled sharply. Then he looked Aaron Donald dead in the eyes. And then I saw you play. Donald's face softened. For the first time all night, he felt something deeper than victory. And the stadium, filled with thousands of people, stood in complete silence. Aaron Donald stood frozen, the weight of the sergeant's words sinking in. The noise of the stadium, the flashing cameras, the lingering cheers, all of it faded into the background. The sergeant took a shaky breath, his hands still clenched, his voice thick with emotion. I was deployed in one of the toughest combat zones, he continued, his eyes locked onto Donald's. Every day I woke up wondering if it would be my last. I lost friends. I lost parts of myself I will never get back. Donald's jaw tightened. He had never served, but he understood struggle. He understood pain. The sergeant inhaled sharply. But one day, I saw a game. Donald tilted his head slightly. The sergeant's voice cracked. It was one of your games. You were down, battered, double-teamed, exhausted, but you just kept going. Donald's chest rose and fell slowly. He could feel the weight of what was coming. That game, the sergeant whispered, was the first time in months I felt something. The first time I remembered what it meant to fight, not just to survive, but to win. He exhaled sharply, blinking rapidly. I was ready to give up, he admitted. I was ready to stop fighting. The crowd stayed completely silent. No one moved. No one whispered. It was as if the entire stadium had stopped breathing. The sergeant wiped at his face quickly, trying to regain his composure, but there was no hiding the emotion in his voice. But watching you play, he said, his voice trembling, reminded me that I still had something left in me, that I could not quit, that I would not quit. Donald's throat felt tight. His entire career, people had called him dominant, a force of nature, unstoppable. But this was different. You saved my life, Aaron, the sergeant said finally. His voice was barely a whisper, but it echoed through the silence of the crowd. And for the first time in his career, Aaron Donald had no words. The only thing he could do was react. Aaron Donald felt his chest tighten. He had been in intense games, faced impossible odds, and battled through injuries. But this moment was different. The sergeant stood before him, raw with emotion, his voice still shaking from the weight of his own words. You saved my life, Aaron, the sergeant repeated, his eyes glassy, his fists now unclenched. Donald exhaled slowly, trying to process the gravity of what he had just heard. This man, a soldier who had faced life and death, was telling him that a football game had given him the strength to keep going. For a long moment, Donald said nothing. Not because he did not care, but because no word seemed big enough for a moment like this. The crowd around them remained frozen, hanging on to every second. Some fans were already wiping their eyes. Even security, usually stone-faced and professional, looked visibly moved. Finally, Donald took a step forward. Man, he started, his voice lower, almost unsteady. I do not even know what to say. The sergeant nodded, a small, understanding smile forming despite the tears in his eyes. You already said it, the sergeant whispered. Every time you take that field. Donald felt his throat tighten. He had played football his entire life, but he had never thought of it like this, as something bigger than the game, bigger than the sport. He placed a hand on the sergeant's shoulder, gripping it firmly. I do not know what you went through, but I respect the hell out of you, he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. The sergeant nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Donald looked him straight in the eye. "You are the real fighter, man. Not me. You." A single tear rolled down the sergeant's cheek, and then Donald did something no one expected. He reached up and took off his game-worn jersey, drenched in sweat, battle-tested from the game. Without hesitation, he grabbed a marker from a nearby staff member, signed it right there, and held it out. "This is yours," Donald said. "And I mean that." The sergeant's hands shook as he took it. His lips parted, but no words came, because in that moment, none were needed. The sergeant stared down at the jersey in his hands, his fingers trembling as they brushed over Aaron Donald's signature. It was more than just a piece of fabric. It was a symbol of resilience, of strength, of a battle fought, both on and off the field. The stadium, once roaring with excitement, was now wrapped in a silence so deep it was almost sacred. Donald took a step back, watching as the sergeant clutched the jersey like it was the most valuable thing in the world. His lips moved as if he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. Then, finally, his shoulders shook. And in front of thousands of fans, beneath the bright stadium lights, the sergeant broke down in tears. He was not just crying for this moment. He was crying for everything he had been through, the battles he had fought, the friends he had lost, the nights he had questioned whether he would make it out alive. Donald did not hesitate. He stepped forward and did the only thing that felt right. He pulled the sergeant into a hug. It was not a quick embrace. It was a hug that meant something, a hug that held the weight of an unspoken understanding between two warriors, one on the field, the other on the battlefield. The crowd, unable to hold back any longer, erupted into applause. Fans wiped their eyes. Players on both teams stopped and watched. Even security, trained to stay neutral, blinked away tears. A cameraman captured the moment, and within minutes, the image was everywhere. A soldier and an athlete, bound by a moment bigger than football. Donald finally pulled away, his own eyes glassy. He nodded at the sergeant, a silent message passing between them, one of respect, one of gratitude. Then, as if the moment could not get more powerful, the sergeant raised the jersey high above his head. The crowd exploded. The sound of cheers and chants echoed through the stadium, a standing ovation for both men. Because in that moment, it was clear. This was about more than just a game. Some moments in sports go beyond the game. This was one of them. Aaron Donald had spent his career as a force of nature on the field, but that night he was something even greater, a source of inspiration for a man who had given everything for his country. The sergeant walked away with more than a jersey. He walked away with a reminder that he was never forgotten. What do you think? Should more athletes recognize the impact they have off the field? Comment below, like, share, and subscribe for more powerful NFL stories.